My brother, a guard, watched an inmate eat his own eyeball. Welcome to Reddit Town Hall. Subscribe for daily videos. People that have gone to jail/prison or worked there. What are your most interesting, funny, scary or gross stories? I was a college instructor teaching in state prisons for several years. At first, I was a bit anxious about being in that environment. After all, I was in a room with about 24 convicted murderers, rapists, child molesters, and drug dealers. It wasn't exactly a welcoming place. But, after about a month, I realized that I had nothing to worry about. I was surprised to find that these guys were willing to put themselves in harm's way to protect the teachers. I had just started my lecture one day when a lockdown was called. Our room was locked from the outside, and we could not move until it was over. We heard, coming from upstairs, what sounded like a riot breaking out. "Teach, get in the corner," one of my guys said, practically pulling me off my feet and pushing me into the corner furthest from the classroom door. The guys then proceeded, without saying a word to each other, to pile all of the classroom desks in front of the door and stand between me and said desks. They were creating a barrier to keep me safe. It turns out that the riot we heard was not as big as we feared, so the lockdown only lasted about an hour. Afterward, once we got the okay and the room was put back in order, I asked the guys why they did what they did. "Some motherfucker hurts you," one of the guys said, "all the teachers will leave. We don't want to lose our education because some assholes can't control themselves. The showers are covered with children." That was all I got for an explanation. I figured it out pretty quick. Always wear shower shoes. Crocs. Flip-flops. Deck shoes. Whatever, wear 'em. I've worked in a prison for some time in medical. What surprised me more than anything else is how many inmates have serious mental illnesses and below normal IQ. Like, no matter how bad and common you may think it is, it's really bad and even more common. A lot of them don't even belong in prison. They definitely shouldn't be out on the street, but they and society would benefit a lot more from keeping them in an environment where they can get real treatment. Prison makes them so much worse. I'll tell you a story. One time, one such inmate was having a fit and asking to speak to someone from behavioral health. Well, it was night shift and we didn't have any BH professionals on duty at the time. So I agreed to go talk to him. He was black male in his 30s. Past violent offender. It turned out that he was angry because he had gotten moved from one cell to another and his radio had gotten damaged and some of his stuff was missing. He was frustrated and didn't feel like he was getting an explanation. The inmate thought it was because everyone hated his music. "They always be complaining about my music and that's why they broke my radio," he said. And to emphasize the point, he turned the radio on full blast with one of Duran Duran's songs playing. When he turned it off after a few seconds, I remarked, "Well, I think that's outrageous. Who would have a problem with Duran Duran?" That got him. "You like Duran Duran?" "Oh yeah. My sister was their biggest fan in the 80s. Played them all the time, which means I was listening too." The inmate's mood changed and he showed me his property form that had everything and asked me to verify that the radio was recorded as undamaged on the form. As I looked at it, I noticed that he had a box of crayons listed among his property. I asked him what sorts of things he draws and colors. The inmate pulled out a folder containing some blank coloring pages that he had of various things. I saw one picture of an owl and mentioned that I like owls. He told me he'd color it for me. "I'll tell you what then. If you will promise to color that owl for me, I will come back tomorrow and visit you to see how you're doing. Deal?" He agreed to it. The next day, I showed up and the guy was absolutely jubilant. The owl was perfectly colored and he insisted that I take it. He couldn't stop talking about it either and he remarked somewhere in the middle, "All my life, my folks told me not to trust white people, but you did. What you said you would." It was such a small damn thing, and it mattered to this man to the point that it made him question the negativity that may have led him to the hard place he found himself in. I will never forget how happy he was right then. For my part, I still have that owl picture hanging on my refrigerator. Edit because people have asked, the owl. I was in jail for only a few days and was in a pod with about 30 other women. On my first day, a fellow inmate announced that it was time for arts and crafts and taught the new girls how to make homemade tampons. Not very sanitary, but man was it entertaining. The things they came up with to pass the time, very creative. Honestly, not many dull moments. Just shitty food and unsanitary living conditions. It was only one day, part of a succession of very short internships to show us various places where psychologists work. Well, the day in the prison. There's the low security guys, with an ambience basically like a kindergarten. Most of them seem to be there due to mental issues/violence. Then there's the medium security guys. Actually more serious, but we didn't stay around them a lot. They apparently are mostly short-term prisoners, who are there for mostly non-physical crimes like scams, fraud, etc. etc. Then there's the high security guys. The aisle actually looking like it's from an American show, some big angry dudes slamming the hell out of the gates. Then you see 5 guys in a corner with laptops. What are they doing there? I ask. Oh, they play League of Legends. They sit there because it's where the Wi-Fi is best. My dad used to work at the Spring Hill Penitentiary in Nova Scotia. He worked in a unit that was using an experimental approach to rehabilitation called a living unit, where the guards wore street clothes and the cells weren't locked. One night he was doing his rounds and he heard a noise in a cell. When he shone his light in the cell, there were 2 guys having an anal adventure. He looked at them and said, "What are you doing?" The guy on the bottom looked up and said, "Minimum of 5-4. Armed robbery." Ah yes, the look at my balls story. This little, old dude who laid on his bunk all day, blanket pulled up to his nose, looking around scared as hell. I think he only got up to use the toilet when the rest of the tank was sleeping, because for a solid week I never saw him leave that bed. Cleaning day came and folks were pulling their sheets for laundry. I was wiping down surfaces and I got to old dude's bunk. "Hey, I need you to get off your bed a second so I can finish cleaning." No, I can't clean." Very high-pitched, scared voice. "You don't need to, I'll do it. You just gotta climb down off your bunk for a quick second." Dude's eyes are popping out of his head as he climbs down the bunk ladder, like he's expecting to be raped and shanked at any moment. I roll up his mattress and try to hand it to him. "No, I can't." "Here dude, just hold it a second." No. Guy is terrified now, nearly wailing. I can't. Look at my balls." He drops his pants and I get to witness the absolute worst inguinal hernia I have ever seen in my life, in person, textbook, or internet. For those who don't know, an inguinal hernia is when a hole or tear occurs in the lower abdominal wall, in the groin area. In severe cases, intestines can push through that hole and cause a bump under the skin. With this guy, the hernia was right below his junk and the intestines had pushed out into his scrotum, giving him a distended ballsack the size of a grapefruit full of his own twisted gut ropes. Must have been unbelievable painful and disruptive to his GI tract. No wonder he looked scared shitless, couldn't move, and certainly couldn't hold a bedroll. Moral of the story is, next time you want to get out of doing chores, look at my balls. 6 months county jail. I never went to the big leagues. Every other arrest was Maine, overnights, weekends, and another very short county stint. Anyways, I was on kitchen duty and they have outside employees as well working in the kitchen. Every single utensil hung on a board in locked cabinets. They were huge and there were 3 of them. We cleaned up after each meal and every single utensil had to be put away, and then the COs checked to make sure there were no missing spaces. Then we went back to the dorms, big rooms filled with bunks that held like 40. After dinner there was a potato peeler missing. The guards make us look for it. We go through trash everywhere and it doesn't show up. They say we can't go back until it's found, so once again we look and they have us looking behind everything and looking in places that you would have to hide or throw something into to get it there. Still find nothing. Now they are pissed. They say that there will be no repercussions if whoever has it will just drop it. The co's even walk away to give the person a chance to drop it. Still nothing, and at this point guys are pissed and saying whoever has it to drop it so we can all go. The guards are heated and are threatening everyone now. Finally at like 1 AM they let us go back to the dorms with the promise that we are all accountable when it shows up. Next day it's like nothing happened. Turned out a lady who worked there had accidentally taken it with her back to their locker room and didn't realize it. She was fired. I worked with a guy that used to be a prison guard. He would tell some wild stories, all of them involved the smell. He said prison smells like butter and butt. One story that stood out was how the prisoners would keep pet roaches and tie string to them to transfer items between cells. One prisoner was trying to get a cigarette to the cell to his left but the roach kept going right. So he grabbed the string and swung it in circles to the left. After that the roach went left. I was in military prison for a few weeks. The guys there put on a play to make me feel like I was gonna get raped. After 2 days of this play, they all started laughing. It took me a good 2 days to understand they had been fooling around with me. I work on a criminal forensic unit in the psych hospital. Most gross story I have is a guy who smuggled in a razor blade and managed to cut himself. Deep cuts, could see the bone and tendons. I remember holding his arm closed so the bleeding would slow. The guy ended up dying on the ward. The smell of iron in the air stayed for the next 2 days. Fucking visible memories, man. A friend told me this story. He was in minimum security prison and lived in a building called a guild, essentially a large bunkhouse with 4 rows of bunks with a 5-foot cement wall running down the middle to divide the middle 2 rows. The guy on the other side of the wall from him had smuggled in a DVD player and some porn movies. My friend's buddy used to always come over to his bunk area and lean over the wall to watch when the other guy was watching porn. One day the other guy saw him doing this and said, "Hey man, why don't you just come over and sit down?" My friend's buddy shook his head and said, "Nah, I like it better like this, it feels like I'm looking in somebody's window." I was only in a jail once, for a few hours to get processed, and assigned a court date. They gave out these bologna sandwiches that nobody ate because, well, they were gross jail bologna sandwiches. One guy was asking for all the uneaten sandwiches, like he was hoarding up some kind of jail currency he could barter with later. I remember he was sitting there on the concrete floor surrounded by stacks of bologna sandwiches with an excited look on his face like, "I'm rich." My time to shine. In my younger days, I may or may not have spent some time in a county jail. Time served, never actually went to prison. Now, this country jail was severely over capacity. So much so that the mess area was used as overflow, and about 40 of us had to sleep on bunk beds they'd plopped down in the middle of this big room. Unfortunately, this area had no toilets of its own, so they left one cell open and unoccupied for a toilet for all of us. Bad jail food, 40 dudes, 1 toilet, not a movie anyone wants to see. Well, I dropped approximately 1/5 of my body weight into that poor toilet, in one extremely dense log. This, much to the chagrin of the guys on the bottom floor cells, caused all of their toilets to back up somehow, flooding their cells with shit water. The guards made us wait outside in the exercise area while plumbers came in. This all happened at like 11:30 at night, in January. No one knows it was me that clogged it all up, which is probably a good thing. TLDR, got poop water all over a bunch of literal felons. My granddad was a prison guard in the UK and had numerous stories. One off the top of my head was they had a tea caddy, fella who used to go to each cell and pour the inmates a cup of tea/coffee. He spilt some on the desk of an inmate who was a bit of a bully. Bully boy beat the shit out of the tea caddy and put him on the hospital wing. At first, my granddad was struggling trying to find a new tea caddy to replace him as no one wanted a potential beating. One guy volunteered and his first trip was straight to the bully's cell. He emptied the urn all over his bed and when the bully tried to attack him, He put him in the infirmary for weeks. I don't believe he ever tried to throw his weight around again after that. Late to the party, but here's a fun one. Guy was in a secure visit with his pregnant girlfriend. For those who don't know, a secure visit is the one with the glass between the prisoner and visitor and they have to use telephones to talk to each other. Anyways, the guy had a short sentence and was getting out soon. As they're getting close to finishing up the visit, the girlfriend who's been secretly masturbating, pulls down her pants and underwear and squirts all over the glass between her and her boyfriend. A prisoner from the biohazard cleanup team had to be called in to clean it up. She was banned from visiting, but no charges were filed. Right after I was born, my mom took a job as a correctional officer at an all-male prison or jail, can't remember, in our small town in Missouri. One day one of the inmates whispered to her that the spiders in his stomach were telling him to eat her. Did 60 days a few times. While locked in the bathroom awaiting pill handouts, a dude with a full-face octopus tattoo asked us if we've ever seen someone receive a fruit basket. He proceeded to pull his pants down and tuck his nutsack in between his legs. When the poor soul came and unlocked the door to hand out pills, he grated them by bending over and displaying his fruit basket. While gross, it was honestly pretty fucking funny lamau. Corrections officer in NZ eating their own shit is always the kicker. I can handle the chronic masturbators, but shit eating is next level. I don't know if this story is interesting, funny or scary, depends on your perspective, but I was in a pod once where we had a regular CO who was a complete piece of shit. He used to try to provoke inmates into starting a fight so that he and his buddies could kick the shit out of the inmate. He would destroy inmates' belongings for no reason. He ripped up a letter from my dad during a search one time and then bragged to me that he did it. He would fuck with inmates' food. He was complete trash. He thought he was a big, tough dude. So anyway, there were a lot of young gang guys in the pod. Gangs are really good at communicating within facilities. So the gang managed to somehow find out the names of the CO's kids and communicate that to the pod. So one day the CO came to do his shift and the pod spent the whole time casually name dropping the kids' names into their general conversation while he was walking by. And that was the last day the CO worked in our pod. Aren't jails just great for reform? There was a shakedown in one of the pods and a couple of stewards were sent to D-pod for contraband. What was the offending item? A loaf of bread they swiped from the dinner cart. Seems like a sad tale, right? Just two fellas looking for a scrap of food. Well, it sure as hell wasn't for snacking on. The two had smushed a hole in the end of the loaf. I cannot say for certain what brand of bread, but I like to think they named her Sarah Lee. Corrections deputy. You see a whole lot of gruesome stuff. 1. A guy tucked his arms in his shirt and jumped off the top tier. Fell head first and brain matter splattered all over the room. 2. Guy beat up another dude so hard, you could see the tendons in his knuckles from scraping the victim's teeth with every punch. 3. Guy punched another guy during breakfast. Hit him so hard he killed him. My dad was falsely imprisoned for a short time a few years ago. He said there was one guy who caused a lot of trouble with guards and whenever he was called out for it, he would say, "What are you gonna do, arrest me?" There was also a guy who threw baby powder or flour, I can't quite remember the details, around his cell because he wanted to see snow. The entire block got punished for that one. Without too many details, I worked at a federal pen through a contract with another company. I was a counselor for inmates. I was working one day when the prison went into total lockdown. I was escorted out of the area I was working in and they locked me in the chapel, alone. This was a fairly large chapel with a big balcony section. I was there for well over an hour. No way to communicate with anyone and no way out. The things you think being alone in a prison chapel, not having a clue what was happening down the halls. I basically relived every prison movie I have ever seen and what took place in them. I thought of what I could use as a shield or weapon if I needed to. If it was even possible for me to find a way up to the balcony area and hide if I needed. What if the dude who locked me in never comes back? Yeah, that was freaky. I know the protocols, but still it cycled through my brain for a few minutes. When the doors finally opened, I hid, not knowing who unlocked it. When I heard specific words, I got up and I was told everything is okay but you gotta go. Was escorted through the many security gates and finally through the entrance. I sat in my car for minutes, breathing in freedom and finally understanding what inmates told me they feel every day. Had an inmate who was always causing problems. He was in a single-man cell and decided to activate the sprinkler in his cell. He thought it was hilarious until the water got up past his knees and then he got scared. The guy's cell was on the upper tier, so when the deputies opened the door the water poured out and made a nice little waterfall down the stairs. I spent a few months in Harris County Jail, Houston. While there, I earned the nickname Zoloft. For the record, I'm a pretty run-of-the-mill tall skinny white dude. The Tangos/House Tones asked me if I was on antidepressants, since I always looked so bummed out. I'm like, bruh, I'm in jail. Who the fuck is happy to be here? They got a laugh and started calling me Zoloft. Not the worst name by any means. I've been out of prison for a decade as of July 5, 2021. Once was enough for me, even if it took 5 years to realize it. I was young, barely 18, and ended up on one of the gladiator camps in TX, the Roach unit. From there, I ended up in administrative segregation on the all-red unit for close to 3 years, until I discharged my entire sentence, a riot against the guards. Seg is nuts. On a best-case scenario, you spend 23 hours a day completely alone, and an hour in a small cage that is open to the sky. That rarely happens, because staying out of trouble with the guards is hard. Realistically, you just spend 24 hours a day alone for years on end. The craziest things I saw in my time in segregation, the guards are often corrupt and malicious. With the rate of illegal contraband alone, you can't really argue it. One of the sergeants decided not to feed 2 black guys. At first he skipped them for a meal, then a full day. Both of these guys had life sentences, one for a robbery that led to someone dying, one for murdering his children. They were all out of fucks. They coordinated with the rest of the people on our run. Each run had 14 cells, 7 below, 7 on the second floor, to make noise all night. So, we all pounded on our doors, yelled, whatever, basically all night. The guards can't really do much to stop something like that other than yell. While we all made noise, these 2 guys jumped on the steel tables bolted to their walls till they busted off. Then, they used the tables to hammer on their door frames at the bottom, breaking them off the tracks. Nobody noticed, because again, the guards basically just ignore your existence back there. So, lunchtime comes. The sergeant shows up with 2 COs. An inmate on the second floor called them to his cell door. While they talked to him, the other 2 guys pushed their doors open. The sergeant saw them coming up the stairs, and must have realized how close to dying he was, because he jumped over these 2 guys and tumbled down the stairs and ran out of the run, and slammed the door shut. He locked his 2 men in with these guys, and it went bad. The guards didn't die, since they weren't who they were after, but they got fucked up bad. Eventually the teams showed up and shot so many grenades into our run that the nurses couldn't come into it for 2 weeks from the residue. The sergeant got fired for abandoning his guys, the 2 guys got beat half to death, and the rest of us choked on tear gas for 2 weeks. I also met SPM a couple times on All Red, but that's a story for another day. Had a cell to myself till a big group came in, all arrested at the same time. Big Dog told me I was sitting on his bunk. I politely told him I just wrecked a car I loved, my head went through the windshield, and I had the worst headache ever. In short, was having a bad night. So, we'd share and both sit up on the bed. Or, we could fight over it, and his night was about to get as bad as mine was. His call. He laughed. His boys laughed. as when breakfast trays were passed out, they realized I couldn't eat dry food because my bottom teeth went through my bottom lip in the wreck. The next thing I hear after giving up my box of cereal, was this same kid yelling down to other holding cells to his buddies to toss down any milk or OJ they weren't drinking. My man here can't chew. I worked as a guard in a prison in Ravenhall, in Melbourne, Australia. The unit was divided between Pacific Islanders, Muslims, Asians and whites. One day a new young Asian man entered the facility and decided it would be a good idea to play basketball with the Islanders. The other Asians couldn't believe this and wouldn't stand for it and decided to educate this young buck about who and who you cannot fraternize with during yard time. The next day I clocked on for my shift at 3 p.m. afternoon to evening shift, and went outside just as the prisoners were coming in from doing their domestic duties, gardening, etc. Well, as I passed the basketball court I saw this young man hanging upside down, feet tied to the basketball ring. At first I thought no biggie, I'll just help him down. When I got closer I saw his bottoms had been torn off and he had slash marks all over his butt. Kind of like when someone takes a razor blade to you. What's even worse is that once we got him down he asked to go to medical because he had a sore stomach. Not wanting to rat out the other Asians, he said it was because he wasn't used to the prison food. Well, it turns out the Asian gang also stuck some items up his ass, items they had obviously collected from around the yard. You can imagine my horror when the medic told me that he had said to them, "I think they shoved a bird up my ass." After 3 days he spent in the medical ward. Can confirm a dead sparrow was jammed right up his ass and had to be fished out in bits. Not my story, but I'll do my best to relay it. 2 inmates at a woman's prison had been bullying a third, and in an attempt to stop the bullying the two were split up, putting one of the bullies into a cell on a different wing. In an attempt to get back at the guard who split them up, the inmate who was moved wrote a note about how the officer was being racist and homophobic and chose to single her out for being a lesbian of color, and gave the note to another inmate to hand to a guard, then went back to her cell. One important thing to know is that these cells were heated by a large pipe running through the back of all the cells that was way too hot to touch. The next morning she was found dead with something tied round her neck, her legs burnt from the pipe, and a towel on the floor at her feet. The officer's theory was that this woman had placed the towel on the pipe to sit on with something, I think it was a pair of socks, tied loosely around her neck so that when the guards came round to do a head count they would see this suicide attempt and it would bring more attention to the note she had written. Somehow the towel slipped, she burnt herself and pulled away from the pipe, tightening the noose around her neck. Just if someone really wants to kill themselves, they will find a way. By God, they will find a way. You couldn't even imagine the things, dude. We had a guy that liked doing naked yoga a lot. One day he also dropped his pants down, pressed his ass against his cell wall shut, and walked sideways to smear it all around his cell. Interesting dude. One of the COs told us a story of the time they performed her bunk search of a block of 12 girls. Inside a Dorito bag, she found a nasty old bratwurst. The girl whose bunk it was acted extremely nervous, and the rest of the girls were acting strange, too. It turns out, all 12 of them were using the sausage as a community dildo. I'm a contractor in the UK who working in prisons from time to time and once saw a guy catch a duck. We all watched in horror thinking he was gonna do something terrible to it. He and his buddies just have it a pet and then threw it up in the air so he could fly off. Was relived. My father spent 30 years of his life working in 2 prisons, first as a head of a penitentiary department in half-open facility, not sure of proper title, he was responsible for inmates' evaluation in a specific block, and then as a warden of a closed one, for more severe, dangerous cases. Here's some of what I heard from all those years. It's probably gonna get buried, but I kinda wanted to drop it off my chest for a while. This happened in Poland. There was one time a semi-successful attempt of an escape by an inmate, who before count managed to build a simple structure to climb a wall, and threw multiple blankets on a barbed wire to get over it. The prison was located in the middle of nowhere, with fields of wheat surrounding it. As he made his run into fully grown field, a guard from a tower noticed the man and started, at first, shouting warnings, to then fire warning shots into the air. With no response whatsoever, he fired exactly one round in the direction of an escapee. Hospital with severe glass damage to their face. Other two, friends of my father, had the grenades blow up nearby their ears, essentially rupturing their eardrums. Both of them don't hear on one ear to this day. Slow government job? Well, as you can see, not very much in certain times. I'm pinpointing not really as someone's mistake in this situation, but rather a misconduct that was a prevalent part of this job, putting you at higher risks in the moments where you really couldn't expect it. It's one of many cases where documents and signatures were more important than you, and you were forced to play an unfair game against the institution. I have to add the practice was obligatory. Okay, last one, and frankly it's the weirdest one to tell. It's not so obviously disturbing, but when I first heard it I had shivers on my back, probably because I could see my father's eyes while he was talking about it. So as a warden, he gets a visit from our country's intelligence agents. It's a typical Tuesday. You show up at work, and after your rounds and quick coffee, the secretary calls. There are two unscheduled gentlemen waiting in front of your door from the agency. The agency is kind of a CIA type of thing. This already doesn't smell good, because what the hell they want from a prison full of already sentenced people? The gentlemen walk into my father's office, and generally this is how the conversation goes. Mr. X. They start, yes, good morning. We are Agent Y and this is Agent Z from the agency. Going straight to the matter, they continue, we are aware you had a new shipment of inmates yesterday's afternoon after around 4 p.m. Yes, we had. Among those there is one gentleman, listed as Mr. B, with a sentence of 8 years for murder. That is correct, yes. And he is designated for sentence in solitary cell. Yes. Mr. X, what you are about to hear is for your ears and your deputy ears only, and he's already been informed. Said gentleman is not really Mr. B, as this is his operative name, as a Russian intelligence officer. This is a national security matter, and this gentleman is under our observation. Agents hinting at my father, the guy doesn't know his cover is blown. Then they continue, under no circumstances tilde. I repeat, no circumstances, anything bad can happen to this gentleman. After a visible break of confusion, I understand. He is now under your responsibility, and we will monitor the situation, as well as you. Again, do not discuss this subject with anyone else. Is everything clear? I suppose, yes. Good, then have a good day. And so they leave. So this looks straight from Hollywood movie, but from a perspective of a rather hard-working, everyday guy. You just got mixed into something smelling so bad, it goes for miles. For starters, in a closed prison for people with the worst sentences, you really can't guarantee anyone's safety 100%. It's your job, of course, and you have to try anyway, of course, but let's be honest, if someone wants to do something, they will find a way. As a warden, you are responsible for your inmates' safety. But you've seen TV shows, you know how this works, it really often does. So you come back home with the stress of, 1, trying to do impossible, overreach your capabilities as a chief, to protect a man you don't care about. This is expanded by the fact that now you might have to do things you can't rationalize to anyone, and will, for example, put your subordinates' trust towards you at risk. 2. Being investigated, wiretapped, and listened to. 3. Not knowing what consequences a failure will bring. I never heard how this one ended. Might be that the matter simply dissolved over time. But I certainly wouldn't want to be dragged into national manners on my normal weekday job without my consent. This just happened there, and where wasn't even an option out. There were so many more, but let's end here. Mostly writing this for people to see that the very institution that I guess strives for had a lady who was a frequent flyer, but I hadn't seen in a few months, brought in. She was pregnant, maybe 5 or 6 months along. Her face and hands were swollen up so bad, her eyes were just little slits. Usually we got along pretty well, but this night she was just staring at the floor ignoring me, so I assumed I had done something wrong to her and let another girl process her. They closed the door to her cell. She started punching herself in the stomach, calling the kid a fucking little slut, cunt, etc etc. We had to go back in and just hold her arms and try to get her to talk it out and calm down. She was so angry and broken. I spent hours sitting on the floor holding her arms and letting her scream and then talk to me. Turns out the cops had been called because the guy who knocked her up was beating the absolute shit out of her in the street. When they rocked up, he had her put her fingers in the car door gap while he slammed the door closed on them. She had a warrant, so they locked her up. He got let out on bail. I felt like the biggest piece of shit wearing the same uniform as those fucking assholes. My dad worked in the prisons in New Zealand for 17 years and he's told me plenty of great stories. For example, a new prisoner that was coming in, they got him to strip down butt naked and got him to squat, and they noticed there was something sticking out his rear end. It was a bag of weed. They mentioned it to him and he pulled it out and started yelling at them and then tried to swallow the bag that had just been pulled out of his ass. Electrician here, did some service work, adding a few plugs to existing circuits, in a corrections, low security, jail. The most interesting thing about it is that we had to get everything checked going in and out of the site. They emptied out our tool bags, took pictures of everything, and on the way out we had to show we had everything we came in with. Need screws, straps, conduit, wire rect. They would count everything we took in. We had to show them where it was being used. If we cut a stick of conduit, we had to track how much we cut and put in the roof and how much scrap we had. Everything had to be accounted for. I totally understand why it was just interesting and also made the job take 3x longer than it normally would have. Gross, lady inmate was extremely obese, insane, and disgusting. She came to jail with scabies and her hair falling out. We made her better in the physical health aspect. She always kept her cell absolutely filthy. We would have to physically restrain her to get her out of her cell and have trustees clean her cell. Catch 22, because we didn't want her in those conditions, but we also didn't want to have to drag her out. Which is worse. Anyway, she grieved this process via another inmate who did it on her behalf. The other inmate was tired of not being able to sleep 24/7 due to heroin withdrawal and the meds associated. Some higher-up said to stop doing it, so we stopped cleaning it save for asking the trash to be removed, which she would comply with. 2 months go by. She gets sent to MH facility and it's time to clean the cell. It was so bad that we didn't want the trustees to suffer through it. The gist was basically shit and piss on the floor. No trash at least. Then to my surprise, I couldn't peel the mattress off the bunk. So I pulled hard and revealed that there was about a ½ inch of coagulated and rotten blood between the bunk and mattress. Turns out the lady liked to put her menstrual blood there because crazy. Couldn't smell it until the mattress was removed because the shit and piss smell covered it. The smell of rotten iron is horrible. Everyone was dry heaving and sick. I did my trick of spraying cologne on a mask and got to work cleaning out of the shit eating, shit fucking, puke eating, puke fucking, a dude committing seppuku, people trying to hang themselves, and shins broken and sticking through the skin. This one grossed me out the worse. Edit, few months. Saw dude shit in the middle of the day room for a bag of coffee, he never got paid. Saw a dude suck on another dude's toes for a Snickers bar. Hell, I've even seen people snort a Benadryl then pass out walking to their bunk. My mom worked for a women's correctional facility when I was really young, so while I know this isn't from her point of view exactly, I still know some of the stories she had told me. The inmates were obviously nice and pleasant if they liked you and if you treated them with dignity and respect. They liked my mom because she was always social and engaging with them. When my mom lost her dad and my great-grandma, it tore her apart. The inmates gave her hugs and helped to console her after they passed away. She even cried on one or two of their shoulders because she was incredibly close with both of them. Edit, this may have been when a few of them were doing community service at that particular funeral home rather than at the actual correctional facility. Along those lines, they hated the fuck out of my aunt, who also briefly worked there until she realized how much the inmates hated her. My aunt isn't nearly as social or kind as my mom is, and they don't get along. Evidently. At one point my aunt said something smartassish to an inmate, and when the inmate told my mom, it went something like, "Mom, I was this close to beating her ass the other day until I remembered she was your sister." Mom told her, "We aren't close." Lol. Mom had breast cancer while working there too, which resulted in a double mastectomy. The male co-workers she had were awful, terrible, and cruel to her about it, and she even said they essentially told her she was less of a woman without her breasts. My mom is a badass and doesn't take shit and is by no means soft, despite crying in front of a few inmates after her two closest family members passed away consecutively after one another. But this did affect her. And the inmates were amazing and supportive toward her throughout the process. I was probably 2 to 3 at the time and clearly had no idea what was happening, but I'm still thankful every day for the inmates who were supportive of my mom during that process when her own co-workers beat her down emotionally for it. Other interesting stories from her time there are when she met Montel Williams when he came to interview an inmate. When an inmate told her that humans do taste similar to chicken when cooked, after she killed, dismembered, and lit her husband on fire for beating her among other things. Another inmate was there because she had suspected her infant to have swallowed her cocaine, and she, went to lengths to try to retrieve it. That resulted in the infant obviously dying, among other charges probably. She was one of the few inmates my mom told me they all feared in some way. I guess she spit at a lot of the workers a lot, among other nasty things. That's what I remember at least. People do all sorts of fucked up shit to themselves to get sent to the hospital for a few days. A guy shoved razor blades into his testicle just to go from being in prison to being handcuffed to a hospital bed. I worked in a prison for a few years. The most interesting story was 2 inmates busted a hole in the cinder block wall in the middle of the night. The room on the other side of the wall was the commissary storage. So they ate their fill of chips and cookies and whatever else, then crawled back into their cell. The damage was discovered the next morning during head count. The funniest is probably me and another guard chasing away a bear cub who got into the prison dumpsters, and the other guard stepped in a big pile of bear poop. Scary was when an inmate died in his cell. Gross was the same inmate who died was caught eating his own feces a few days before. He had bad mental issues. Had a bad batch of heroin snuck into our county jail, happened sometime on our day shift as I came for night shift. 2 hours into shift we had 4 back-to-back cards. Doing CPR and narcaning people over and over made it a night from hell. Every inmate ended up surviving and we found the source, so the story had a happy ending, but the whole event took years off my life. I went to county jail for a few months right after I turned 18. I was young and scared and had no idea what I was in for. The jail was extremely overcrowded at the time, so they just kinda stuck you wherever. I got put in a cell with this woman that was on a 12-day psych lockdown. I was not prepared. The second I get in there she starts talking about the Bible. I hop on the top bunk and act like I'm sleeping, hoping she'll shut up. Didn't work. She just keeps pacing around the cell, talking about the devil and government, and she's butt-ass naked. Then I hear her peeing, but it doesn't sound right. She was peeing standing up, getting piss all over the toilet seat and floor. At that point I really started questioning my life choices that got me there. I was locked in that cell with her 23 hours a day for 11 days. She only put clothes on when we were allowed out for showers. It was an experience. Went into county for 2 days due to a DUI. I'm getting escorted to my block, then to my cell. As I'm approaching my cell, I see the top of someone's head pop around the corner of the cell next to mine. Alan, what are you doing here? Oh, hey doc, just some past stuff. It was one of our group's bar buddies, had no idea he was in there. It was just surreal and caught me off guard. Gotta love small towns. This was 6 years ago. He's since got his act together and living sober life. I moved out of that state and will never get another DUI. Just call an Uber. My mom taught 4 Hells Angels members make cinnamon rolls. They taught her how to make napalm. Mind you, this was before internet was what it is today. She was also allowed to try on an harvest, which is a big no-no, all while she worked at a prison in Sweden. Oh shit, finally. I worked at a county jail in Oklahoma. I was 19, scared to death of inmates, although I did play checkers with a murderer, and I hated the job. However, one night we had a dude come in on suicide watch. I was in the tower, watching him on camera, and I noticed he started taking off all his clothes. Buck-ass naked, my dude climbed to the top bunk and stood on it. I hit the panic button, all guards to the cell ASAP, he's gonna jump, let's go. 3 folks run in just as he jumps. He was aiming head first, but got the angle wrong and his shoulders hit first, essentially pulling off an incredible tuck and roll that only knocked the wind out of him. However, when the guards started trying to put a straitjacket on him, he came alive. He starts flopping around and going nuts, and one poor sumbitch had the gross misfortune to be down by his cash and prizes. The guy sunfishes and flips over, and when he did, just the tip of his broadsword grazed the tip of the poor guard's nose. The guard recoiled like he'd been shot in the face, and scrambled back against the wall, slapping at his face like he's stepped into a horde of mosquitoes. If one day Alzheimer's chooses to take me, rob me of my memories, I would want that 45 seconds to survive more than the memories of seeing my firstborn swaddled in my wife's arms. We rewound and played the tape back so much it eventually screwed up the film. Homeboy would save everyone's crackers and risk an extra 3 months of jail time just to get a sip of some yeasted out yeet. Just thinking of some of the shit I saw in prison makes me feel very strange. I'd relive some of the memories here for small digital clout points, but honestly, it was such a horrific experience I'd rather not regale them. The one that stands out is how homesick I was, and was telling myself that I wasn't. One day I walked from my room, I don't remember waking up, but I walked through my house, my mom was making breakfast. I was adopted by my grandparents, so they were mom and dad to me. I sat down with my elderly father, and he had the strangest look at peace, but a smile. I sat down and we talked, I don't remember about what, but I couldn't get over this feeling of longing. Like I wanted so bad to reach out and hug him, and something just didn't feel right. I felt close to him but so very far away. I looked at him for a very long time and said, "Am I really here right now?" And he said, "I don't know. Are you?" I closed my eyes, then opened them again. I was staring at a blank lime green steel metal wall, and realized I was in prison the whole time. Having a dream of being home with my family. I have never felt so incredibly alone. I got arrested for DWI when I was young. They gave my passenger a ride to the station. While waiting for his ride, he asked to use the restroom. They took him to a cell, and left him. They set a court date for him, and when he showed up, the judge had no idea why he was there. Doorphobia. People who've been incarcerated even in a nice prison often can't stand doors. Getting their own flat afterwards, first thing they do is unhinge doors. Prison think. 2 neighbors, both of them ex-convicts, were chatting from window to window when one of them wanted to show the other one a book or something. One gathered string, the other some basket, and then they sent each other the item via basket. It only occurred to them the next day that they could have used the corridor between the 2 flats. So one night while working midnights on one of my walks in the middle of the night as I was passing by an inmate's cell, he had his leg hiked up on his sink in his cell completely naked, thrusting a VO5 shampoo bottle in his asshole, and this wasn't one of the sample size bottles they can get for free, it was a large one he bought off commissary. I stood there frozen and he deadass looked me in the eyes for a solid 5 seconds and continued to thrust the bottle in and out before I walked away, just stunned at the disgusting sight I just witnessed. Not me personally, but a woman that is a family friend worked in a federal prison. When she was pregnant, the inmates hosted a baby shower type of thing. They also gave her a plan if she was ever working and broke water, how they would help her or get her help. She told me those inmates were some of the nicest people she's ever met. A former inmate told me when he was picked up and in transit they stopped to pick up someone else, with the two of them on the back of the vehicle handcuffed. The chick got out of her handcuffs, had a razor and slit her wrists. Blood was going every damn where, especially all of him, and there was nothing he could do. Not me, but my buddy I served with. He worked as a warden part-time, and there was this guy locked up who would do nothing but masturbate. Day in day out. They didn't bother learning his name and just called him Jack. Went to jail for a bullshit VOP, self-surrendered at 11:58 p.m. so I spent as little time as possible in. Got to my cell, large tank with multiple open cells, and there was this heavily tattooed guy with a traditional Native American headband tattooed around the crown of his skull. We got to bullshitting for a little bit about tattoos and how great hallucinogens were back in the day. All around seemed like an alright dude. Flash to a week later, I'm at home online, and who happens to pop up but my cellie on the local news page. Now apparently this seemingly alright guy had actually kidnapped and murdered his at the time girlfriend, drove down a county or two, then kicked her body out of his truck into a ditch to rot. I was locked up 9 days after my 18th birthday and did a total of 12 years. There are too many gross stories to pick from, and I really don't remember any funny memories, but I'll give you an interesting one. I was in a medium security and the setup was mostly huge dorms. This consisted of 2 floors with hundreds of bunk beds all within 3 feet of each other and a few cleaning supply closets on both floors. There was 1 guard per block and their desk was on the first floor. At this time I had been locked up about 7 years and my bunk was on the 2nd floor. It was late at night and I was on my bunk reading and drinking something while most people were asleep. I ended up spilling my drink and had to go downstairs to the only unlocked supply closet to get a mop. I did notice the female 3rd shift guard wasn't at her desk and assumed she was doing her rounds. When I got to the supply closet, I opened the door and immediately saw the guard having full-on sex with an inmate. I had taken a step or 2 inside before my brain registered what was going on. The guard and inmate looked at me and froze. I backed out, shut the door and went back to my bunk without saying a word. A day passes by and then another. On the 3rd day, the inmate I had seen came up to me and out of the blue gave me a quarter Oz of weed while telling me how cool I was to keep my mouth shut. That guard worked there for another 2 years and I was in the same dorm as the inmate for another 4 years. During that time I never brought up the subject with the guard or inmate, and I was never without weed or a 3rd shift guard that would look the other way when I needed it. On a similar note, a while later another inmate busted a woman guard having sex and the inmate threatened to tell if he couldn't get some. The guard immediately called for backup and had him sent to the hole for threatening her with rape. He hollered at the top of his lungs that he had seen her having sex while he was being dragged to the hole. It didn't matter, none of the other guards believed him. Oh fuck, strap in for this one. When I was interning out of college with intake, they wanted to bring me down to the women's segregated units. They kept chuckling to each other, telling everyone where they were taking me, and everyone kind of got the yike face. Nobody would tell me why she was there. So we walked down, 2 COs, forensic psychologist, intake officer, and someone else. Though this is excessive to go see one person. No? We get down there and the 2 COs take her out of the cell and she walks beeline right for me and stops like an electric fence was keeping her away, but she could have at any moment broken that 2-foot space. She stares at me the entire time she is answering their questions and never breaks body language of "you're lucky they're here." I just ignored her, wrote on my clipboard, didn't change my body language, looked up when she answered a question but didn't back up. All the things they tell you to do. After we left they told me why she was in She'd murdered 2 kids, not hers, and at sentencing when she was given her sentence she took all her clothes off, removed her tampon and covered herself in her own blood, and ran naked out of the courtroom, caught in the hallway. I ended up becoming an elementary school teacher. Medic here. Picked up a dude nicknamed the Joker because he would continually cut his cheeks into a smile with razor blades like the Joker. He also swallowed the razor he did it with before he got caught. He would take pen fillers, the part of the pen with the ink and metal tip, and stab them into this basically permanent hole in his abdomen because he would do it so often. Dude had like 30 pen fillers in his abdomen. Doctors were stunned he didn't have a colostomy bag by now. This story has a moral at the end. My dad was a prison guard and stand at about 5'8". Not that many guards work at his prison in Texas. So everyone is in the rec yard doing whatever, and my dad calls for count time. Inmates must return to their cells/bunks in their dorm for accountability. That's when my dad met Mr. Hawkins. My dad said Mr. Hawkins was that inmate that everyone respected. He looked like John Cough from Green Mile. And he was lifting weights. Now, all the inmates started going to their cells, except Mr. Hawkins, who continued to work out. Mr. Hawkins, it's count time, my dad reminded him. Hawkins stopped, towered over my dad and says, I ain't going to bed, boss. This was all in the rec yard. The next guard is 3 dorms over. If a riot were to break out, or if something happened to my dad, nobody would know except the inmates, who all stopped to see what Mr. Hawkins was about ready to do. My dad slowly reaches in his back pocket for his pad and pen, and says, Mr. Hawkins, if you don't go to the bed, I'm going to have to write you up. Mr. Hawkins changed up. Oh, I was just kidding, boss man, I'm just playing. And he went with the other inmates back to their dorm. My dad said that was one of the most intense times he ever had as a CO. He had to have the mental fortitude to think about writing him up versus trying to force the situation. I'm the officer, you're the inmate, you do what I say. Oh yeah, the moral. Pen is mightier than the sword. Worked in a prison kitchen in UK. It's a bit of a long story, but the short version is, one of the inmates managed to smuggle his own shit in his hand and dropped it onto the soup urn going to the VP wing, sex offender and grass wing basically. The shit floated to the top, so he grabbed a hand blender and blended the shit into the soup. At least 25 pedophiles ate the shit soup before they stopped giving it out because of the suspiciously rank smell. I won't lie, I found it fucking hilarious. As well as absolutely disgusting. No, I didn't know what he had done until after the soup came back. I just got on with the lads well enough to get a confession out of them afterwards. The guy in question was sacked from the kitchen the next day. Had a guy come in high as hell and acting crazy, so he was put in a dry cell. He took all of his clothes off and covered himself in his own shit. We ended up pepper spraying him, and the smell of shit and mace is one of the worst things I have ever experienced. It wasn't me working there, but my father worked at a state prison that mainly housed rapists and sexual predators. When I was little, I overheard him making a report on the phone at home about a gentleman in the yard who had been digging up worms, hiding them, and when he decided he had enough, had shoved them up his ass. My hubby was a state prison guard for 10 years and had Danny Rawlings, the Gunville Ripper, on his block. He said the man was an absolute nutcase, always on his knees singing and screaming things out loud that made no sense. He was put in the hole many times before being put to death. He was the man that killed the young college kids in Gainesville, Florida. Not really a story, but my dad used to work at a supermax prison. He said there were the most disgusting, rude, and vile people he'd ever met. Then there were the inmates. Not mine but my aunt's story. She worked in a prison as a teacher for 20+ years. On one of her first days there she taught geography and gave out maps to the students so they could study about where they were, America, Europe, etc. The next day she comes back and gets scolded because of the fact that the inmates could use them as escape maps. The maps got confiscated. My aunt never gave out maps again. I was just there for a little over a day, but I was a little 17-year girl who chronically looked scared in a room full of older women. We were eating lunch and the lady next to me was eyeing my tray. After a bit she said, "Damn, you ate that fast, do you want mine?" She was referring to the cornbread I ate first. I said sure and ate hers too. Others starting offering their cornbread too, but I was too full. Then another lady said I sure do like eating dessert first. Turns out the cornbread was cake. I was shook and everyone thought it was hilarious. Look up Larry Lawton, he's got a ton of stories on YouTube and is a genuinely good dude. He went to prison for being a jewel thief for 17 years. I knew jail wasn't for me when they took my glasses, eyeglasses, belt, and shoelaces for suicide avoidance. Luckily I only stayed overnight though. I only served in a civilian capacity as an information clerk, i.e., receptionist that would answer calls from the public for charges / bond amounts / release status / etc. So my stories won't be anywhere near as juicy. Just anecdotal. So many calls would be people wanting to argue someone's charges with me, as if I was the arresting officer and or judge. Would try to get a word in edgewise to simply give them the information I could, but sometimes to no avail. Luckily, we had authorization to hang up on people if they curse at us, after giving one warning. But the most memorable call I got went like this. The caller had a very deep, impassioned voice. The first few moments were rushed almost to the point of incoherence. County Jail Complex, T. Butterfield. I'm sorry. What was that? Butterfield. Did you say Butterfield? Butterfield. Is that the name of someone you want information about? Butterfield. Does a search in the database, I'm sorry sir, there does not appear to be anyone with that name booked in at the moment. Butterfield? No, sir, no one with that name. Slower, in a very dejected tone, Butterfield. Abruptly hung up, never heard from him again. My uncle wrote to me, he's like, hey, you know that guy that killed Matthew Shepard? Right across from me right now as I'm writing this. It was weird to think about. From another thread, I went for a job interview at a prison if it counts. The worst thing I saw was a guy who had serious psychiatric issues. Anyway, he'd carved a hole into his own tummy that wouldn't heal properly as he was always hiding stuff in there. One day he tried to hide a little towel or something in there and apparently bits of it had started fusing to him inside. Pretty much noped out of that job. I work in county. We had a girl come in, high on a mix of things. She was speaking nonsense and refused to be processed. We took her up to our medical unit and had her in a holding cell until she came off of whatever she was on. While she was up there, she proceeded to get completely naked and start hitting her head, lightly, on the window of the door. At that point I had to go inside the cell and point her by her ankle to the wall. When I went in and put the shackle on, she put her hands out at me and started chanting something and said she cursed me. The next shift took her off the shackle, and she ended up having liquid shit all over the cell. She then ate the poop, rubbed it in her hair, and then shoved it in herself and masturbated with it. To this day we refer to it as a shit and spin because she was spinning like a top in her own diarrhea. The smell in that cell was unlike anything I've ever smelled before. Just seeing her shovel her own shit in her mouth and gag as she's chewing it hurt me. I was working for a fairly well-known Swiss security company. We did the jail portion of a psych ward, if they had prisoners. But we didn't work there full-time, only on demand. This one bloke apparently put a nurse into the hospital, so they locked him in his isolation cell to calm him down. The next day we were called. He'd been in his cell for over 24 hours. 5 of us went in the room. It stank. There was piss everywhere. And he'd written "pray" on the wall in his own shit. We took him down, desperately trying to avoid kneeling in the piss, then dragged him out to a bed where the nurses tied him up while we held him down. He calmly thanked us for having taken him down, seeing as we were real warriors, not some pussies, due to working in aforementioned security company. He saw himself as a samurai and didn't ever drink or do drugs. Then he started yelling about how he'd get revenge on the cops. And back to calmly telling us how we should kill child molesters, not turn them in to the authorities. I still smell the feces when I think back on the whole incident. I think the weirdest part of my 4 days in county was how nice everyone was to me. The rackmates all around were in for heavy shit, but maybe they took pity on me. One for attempted manslaughter on a cop, self-admitted. I don't know why. They shared rations of food and snacks. When the sheriff barely tapped me for release at 3 a.m. it was a rackmate that shook me awake and said, "Get the fuck up, dog. You getting out?" Honest to goodness nice moments in a hellish time in my life. I did weekends in a jail at the same time a Virginia state senator was serving a 6-month suspended work release program. He got re-elected from jail in a special election where they tried to vote him out. I was in prison in Northern Ireland, and a screw who used to work in the sex offenders wing said he used to regularly find pool cues and other objects with condoms on them and blood and shit all over the place. I had a job in the kitchen, and the food trolley for the sex offenders was never cleaned properly. The food was never fully cooked. Fuck knows what else people were doing to it. One time a tray of chips/fries fell on the floor, and a screw told the kitchen workers to just send it over to them instead of throwing it out. When I was in school, we went to see a police station. In the holding cells we found that one of our classmates, who was held there for a few days some months ago, had written his name on the wall. The guards remembered him and we joked about it. I worked at a maximum security facility that specialized in sex offender rehabilitation for a year and a half. During a cell check one night, one of the cell doors had a jacket stuffed into the slot. They do this for privacy while using the toilet. Well, we have to check on them every 59 minutes, so I shined my flashlight over the top of the jacket, and saw one of the inmates bent over, obbered the other with both of his hands up the guy's asshole. I told them to quit it, and they jumped into their bunks as if nothing had ever happened. A few cells down, I found 2 inmates wrestling. But they were naked, and one of them was blowing the other one. Never going back. I worked at the Clark County Jail in downtown Las Vegas when I was about 18 or 19. My mom was a nurse there and got me a job as a file clerk. I saw a lot of crazy stuff. She had even crazier stories, like having to pull a pencil out of a guy's sternum, or a guy who wrapped himself in toilet paper and lit it on fire to try to kill himself. Some random stuff I remember not too much with the prisoners themselves. One time a guy wearing a vest that would taser him if an officer pushed a button lunged at me to test if the officer would do it. He didn't. Found out later he was in the vest for breaking the warden's arm. Also times I'd be alone in an elevator and a corrections officer would load a ton of shackled prisoners in, so I'd be backed into a corner surrounded by a bunch of huge guys. They weren't supposed to do that. The smell of the kitchen. It was right under the intake area, where all the drunks from the night before would be puking, peeing, and crapping everywhere. The body odor, smell and all the others would float down to the kitchen and combine with the powdered eggs being mushed in plastic bags, huge vats of chili and spaghetti. It was gross and stayed in your nose all day. John Wayne Bobbitt came through booking once and a bunch of nurses got his autograph for some reason. I'd see the place I worked on cops sometimes. That's how I discovered the chair I would sit in to look through medical files was also the chair they did the AIDS test on prostitutes in by taking blood. One of the male nurse, who was a huge horn dog, came into the office, while staring down the hallway, saying "damn." I thought she was like 15. Found out later he was looking at Elizabeth Berkley. She was filming Showgirls and they had a scene inside the jail that was cut. You can still see it behind her in a scene where she'd being released. I missed seeing her by about 5 seconds. My mom also ruined a scene for a film they were shooting in the lobby by not realizing she was in the shot and watching. It wasn't Showgirls, some other film starring Danny DeVito. My brother would pick me up from work sometimes and would also give random dudes who were just released rides home. I did not think that was a good idea. One of the nurses I'd talked to a lot on my breaks got fired and busted for stealing Soma pills. One of the female corrections officers fell in love with an inmate and got fired, and then got caught trying to sneak in to visit him wearing a wig. The head of the medical department got fired because he and some others had a pool going for which prisoners with serious medical conditions would die first. Pretty messed up to be in charge of a person's well-being if you stand to win money if he dies sooner. He was a massive asshole, and I was glad to hear he threw a fit and had to be chased around his desk before security escorted him out. Not exactly related to the jail, but one of the nurses my mom worked with would also work at one of the major hospitals in Vegas. For some reason when Tupac died she called my mom and told her, and my mom then called and told me. I went onto a rap forum on IRC and told everyone. They got really pissed off calling me a liar. Then about 20 minutes later it was announced on the radio and they were devastated. I always think of that when people are like Tupac is still alive. Probably a bunch of other stuff I don't remember. I spent a lot of time in a back office room photocopying medical files. It was depressing. At times, I'd see the sex with less than 14 written on a lot of files, which would disgust me every time. Honestly, the prisoners were pretty okay. The corrections officers would fuck with me a lot though. There were huge, heavy pneumatic doors that they'd control from another room, and I'd have to show my badge to a camera to be let into another area or let on or off an elevator. Sometimes they just wouldn't let me in for a while or fuck with me over the intercom, or they'd start the door shutting the second I started walking through it, scaring me because I'm pretty sure those things could take off an arm. I spent one night several years ago, for hitting my child's father. The ladies they put me in with were pretty nice, if you can believe it, lol. Anyway, after dinner time, a few of them carried their sleeping pads into one of the other bunk rooms. There was a larger room with 2 long tables that had benches attached, and a TV that broadcasted news/weather mounted to the wall. There were several smaller rooms each with 1 to 2 bunk beds. Said they were going to do yoga. Asked if I wanted to join, but I had been crying because I missed my baby, who was just 3 months, and said no. Between weather and news reports I heard some not so yoga sounding noises. And it wasn't fighting. Caught dude strung out on meth blasting himself in the ass with the handle part of an ice scoop in the showers one night when I was making my rounds. Midnight shift was weird. County jail. I was in general population, a room with maybe 20 bunk beds and mostly kept to myself, was reading a romance novel around 10 AM on my top bunk. Suddenly there's commotion at the next bunk over. I didn't see it start, but the top bunk guy screams, "I've had enough of this shit," pulled back the blanket which was hanging down, and the 2 guys start pushing and screaming. Lower bunk guy, a white kid in his very early 20s with a bunch of acne, was a chronic masturbator, and top bunk guy had enough of it. The guards came in, and surprisingly, the upper bunk guy was not punished, but the masturbator was walked out off to solitary or a different pod or something. People weren't really laughing about it, but the mood was different, and some people told the guy he was okay and they'd do the same thing, etc. A few minutes later, a female guard came in wearing gloves, and she had to break down the bunk and collect the kids' belongings. She tried not to act grossed out, but we could sense how uncomfortable it was, and everybody was very respectful. I was in for 3 more days. The kid never came back. And I'd never thought about it before, but that's where I learned the difference between famous and infamous. I spent a night and a morning in the Hennepin County Jail. Lot of interesting characters. They had a bunch of us all locked in big room/cell that had a handful of bunks, like a depressing summer camp. Come morning they bring us food and everyone lines up to grab a tray and a drink. I sit down at a table and right away people are talking to me about how old I am and what I did to get in there. I was 19 to 20, so I'm sure they were curious what a young guy like myself did to end up in there. So I'm talking to a guy, and as I go to open up the milk the guy tells me not to drink it. Why, I ask. He says because they put Peter softener in the milk, it makes it so your dick can't get hard. Luckily for him that was okay with me. Still have no clue if that was true or not, ha ha ha. I was in jail for 3 days for something I didn't do. When I told anyone who was in there that I was innocent, they believed me without question. That was more or less the only silver lining of the whole experience. I was a mid-career network engineer assigned to help bring a new classroom environment, GED studies, with about 12 plus laptops also online and also a DIY vending area for the COs and staff. This was maybe my second time at this jail facility, and I normally work like libraries and parks and wastewater and stuff. So I'm already a little on edge from having prisoners and everything around. I was underneath a table doing some layer 1 troubleshooting and suddenly something was poking me in the crotch and ass area, seriously goosed me. I turn around, and a 6-month-old lap puppy named Sergeant Leo, is sniffing my business and wanting to play. Was quite a shock, but worth it to get a puppy play break in the middle of the project. Smiley face. Sergeant Leo was the new third dog in a highly successful inmate rehab program. From what I understood, the rate of inmate violence, especially suicide, dropped tremendously thanks to these dogs and their handlers. I was in for some alcoholic charges after a rave I attended. I was booked Friday and they said I wouldn't be released until Monday after I was arraigned. I wasn't in a county or state prison, just the holding cell with a bunch of other women at the station. First night was alright. I made friends with a couple of the escorts. One of them even asked me out and I got a sweet contact which led me to my first stripping job. They had clearly been in before, so they were used to it and knew all the rules, as well as the guards. Their daddy bailed them out the next morning. Second night I made friends with a stay-at-home mom in for domestic violence. I think we spent 6 hours talking about baby stuff. She offered me a babysitting job which I thought would be cool until she turned the temper on me. The last night was just boring. On Monday I was arraigned, where I admitted to drug use, not alcohol. I was transferred to a mental health facility, which is an entire different story. Had a person writing on the wall a list of guards and trustees he didn't like or who he felt wronged him. It was in poop, with his fingers. He called it his shit list. Classic. The lawnmower blade they found in the drain of mop bucket storage room. Like a damn Braveheart scene was coming and they were ready for their part. Shank. That was a sword. There was a man, an older black man. I cannot remember his name. He used to pay $20 cash for shit. But not just any shit. White boy shit. And there was no tricking him. He knew anytime anyone tried to trick him. Why did he want it, you ask? So he could smear it on bread to make a sandwich and eat. I'm not kidding. Pick a category. Violence or medical. Watched a dude swallow a razor blade tied to a string and then proceed to pull it back up. Saw a gang stomp a pedophile to death on the yard because he missed his protection payment. Watched a guy get his brain smashed out of his skull with a 20 pounds plate weight when his was mid-bench press. Not really a crazy story, but I got caught jerking off in the shower during an emergency count. I was so into the moment that I didn't hear the cops and others yelling for an emergency count. Literally about to finish, and then all of a sudden the makeshift curtains get ripped down. I spin around scared and confused to see 2 cops just standing there shaking their heads in disgust. We just stared at each other for a good 10 seconds before they finally marked down the count and walked right out of the dorm without saying another word. At which point everyone in the dorm is now taking well-deserved cracks at me. Everyone was laughing, and all I could do was own it and laugh myself. And that's why they call me Soapy Delicious. I was a deputy for a larger county jail. The inmates' stories are varied, however I wanna point out what shocked me. Some deputies bringing in contraband. I used to relieve a guy and everyone was doing drugs in the pod, it seemed. The inmates hated me cause I would write them up. Anyway, they fired the guy but no direct talking to me. Along the years others got caught too, and those were the obvious ones. How can you make $50K a year, full benefits, sooner than average retirement, and take money from inmates' families to sneak in shit and make it harder for good PPA to do their job? That always blew my mind, honestly. I used to return prisoners from a hospital downtown back to state medical prisons for males/females. It's incredible how insecure they are. Prisoners walking beyond the red lines in control rooms and everyone seems unalarmed because they're deemed medically ill. I went to jail once. My buddy and I were out drinking. I made sure to pace myself, 1 drink per hour sort of thing, but my friend drank a lot and started to get belligerent. Like he wanted to fight. Long story short, we got arrested after he tried to fight a cop. While in jail, I am miserable. The room is freezing, dirty, brighter than the sun, and it's 3 a.m. and I'm not even close to being buzzed to sleep. I lay down, try to get comfortable, and someone gets up to go to the bathroom, which is in the middle of the room. But instead of taking a dump or piss, he starts masturbating. Here I am, I shouldn't be there, I can't sleep, and I have to listen to some guy jerk off for 20 minutes. I worked at a prison as a corrections officer. I was shocked how many female correction officers would be arrested for sleeping with inmates. It was happening regularly. I've spent about 5 months total in county jail. First time I went and was getting processed, I looked up and saw a camera monitor showing inside a holding cell that had a completely naked woman on her knees and shoulders reaching back, just doing her thing, vigorously. A few months later I had to unfortunately fight a guy who tried to punk me for my table spot, became instant jail pod celebrity after that, and went to the hole where I saw an inmate finger painting the walls with his shit. Dude was totally nuts and should have been in a hospital. I didn't see this one, but guys in my pod had seen a guy swan dive from the 2nd floor head first a week before I arrived. Went to jail for about 2 weeks. The food some nights looked like they cleaned the sink disposal onto trays. Was not enjoyable those nights. I've had inmates waffle stomp shit in the shower drains. I think the most surprising thing I learned was about myself, how much empathy I can have for people who have done the most horrific things. I've spoken to people arrested for starving their kid, raping a grandmother, killing cheating partner's infant. That's just in the last year. I try my best not to think about their charges when interacting with inmates, and sometimes even tell people I don't know what they are charged with, a lie for my own comfort. But even when I am thinking about it, it's not hard to remember they are still a person going through a terrible time, and I always hope they know that someone still sees value in them. It kind of surprised me because I used to always think I would wish death or suffering onto people who did these sorts of evil crimes. But when I talk to them, I just see their pain. I was 16 and in juvenile hall US, and was waiting to go to a group home due to being kicked out of my previous for drug use. It was just a violation of probation which put me in the non-violent unit. The main difference between violent and non is that folks in the non could be out of their cells/units more and work. Those that worked were put in group cells. This particular unit I was in had a 5-man cell across from a 4-man cell. I was in the 5-man and could see the 4-man from my little window in the door, though I couldn't see the happenings inside. One day I'm in the cell minding my own business when all of a sudden I hear some scuffling and struggle from the 4-man. I just figured someone was fighting again. Turns out, 3 of the 4 had turned on the other and sexually assaulted him. I felt really bad for the guy. I would call the 3 animals, but that would be an undeserving insult to animals. My grandfather and father were both jailers. Thankfully my father had a very uneventful jailing career, but my grandfather had a much more interesting one. He was an MP during the Vietnam War and served part of his time as a jailer for a military prison. At some point 2 prisoners had managed to get a hold of a chain and got around his neck, pulling him against the bars of their cell. He was about to lose consciousness when the 3rd dude in their cell, a guy I was told was 7.5 feet, tall and built like an ox, barreled into the 2 and beat them unconscious to save my grandpa. This guy never talked much, but when asked why he saved him, he told my grandpa "I like you," and shrugged. After that my grandpa did what he could to help the guy out, keep him comfortable as possible. They became as close as you can when your new friend never speaks a word unless ordered and then barely speaks at all. Guy was supposedly a John Doe. No one knew how he got there or why, only that he got violent when they tried to release him, so they were basically just keeping him to keep him happy. Never learned his name either. My grandfather just referred to him as my boy when talking about him. One day he had to leave the prison to participate in a soldier's burial service. I remember him laughing about how all of their white gloves got stuck in the adhesive around the coffin, so they buried him with them sticking out of it and thought it was a good send-off since he was supposedly a jokester. Anyway, about halfway through, one of his COs pulled him aside and told him, "Your boy has gone crazy, they need you to go calm him down." So he got a plane and flew back to the prison to find the whole place basically locked down. Turns out his boy had gotten into an altercation in the yard and brained the two guys who tried to kill my grandpa with a baseball bat. This was a few years after that event, and basically broken into and barricaded himself in a shack on the yard. Apparently no one wanted to shoot the guy, but he wasn't letting anyone close to him, so my grandpa stepped out into the yard, finger whistled, and pointed to the ground right in front of him, like you would to a dog. The dude walked right out, calm and serene, and walked right up to my grandpa, gave him the bat and hugged him before breaking into tears. After that, I don't know how much more contact my grandpa had with the guy, because that was the only story I got about him. Spent 4.5 months inside awaiting trial because I wasn't registered at the time. Well, one of the guys who handed out the meals was Italian, and I thought cazzo was a friendly greeting like mate, so imagine his reaction when my cell door was opened and I greeted him with, "Hey cazzo." And by my first time in the shower I said to a black guy, "So it's not true what they say," while pointing at his normal sized dick. He saw the funny side, unlike the Italian who wanted to kill me. An inmate wrote my name on her cell wall using menstrual blood. This was on a solitary tier and she hated me. If I was in solitary I may have gotten creative as well. Glad I left that mess 10 years ago. My partner works in a prison and she made me aware of a little thing called spooning, and no, it's not the act of lying in each other's arms. Basically, when prisoners get word of a transfer coming in with drugs up their bum, several will hold that prisoner down while another literally spoons the drugs out of their ass. I can't imagine that the drug mule's comfort is high on the list of priorities. Two kinda small stories. These guys were, one was like 60-yo, main character, talking and bashing on this other dude, was like 20-yo. Both were ex-meth heads, and the 60-yo, while laughing at a mean joke on the 20-yo, spilt his own tea during lunch and forced the 20-yo to clean it up. After a few yelling matches the fight got broken up and the 60-yo spent a month in the hole for starting it all. For like 3 days-ish all the guys from this room were asking people for their butter, cornbread, and cereal at breakfast time and dinner time because they were trying to make coffee cupcakes. Needless to say, the eggs are not just for show in those recipes. They opened the microwave to reveal nothing but what looked like quicksand and spit in 4 sad little plastic coffee cups. The smell too. Caused our whole block, like 30 dudes, to smell like burnt plastic and cornbread. Caused the deputies to ban the microwave for a week. They weren't the most popular subgroup in that block after that. P.S. I was in Johnson County, Kansas jail. Apparently it is on a top 3 of hardest jails to escape from in America and has a high notoriety for how unmoving the staff is. Meaning they pretty much treat you like children and don't give a fuck about what's going on until they have to, like the first story. The deputy was there before the fight even started and only stopped it because fists were about to fly. According to my ex-sheriff deputy friend who worked at a jail, more cops than you'd expect rape women in prison. They don't pin them down and force themselves on them like your idea of rape, but they definitely use the power difference to coerce women inmates into feeling that it's a good idea. Did 1 month when I was 18, it wasn't bad except for this one day I was in the shower alone and these 2 big, muscular guys came in and started whipping hard objects at me, batteries, soap, etc., so I just crouched down and covered my head. Got pretty bruised up on my side, it definitely could have been much worse. I never did anything to them, so I have no idea why they did it. Maybe because I was a young new kid, I'm not sure. I got along with most people including my cellmate, and I knew a few guys in there, so it wasn't bad other than that one day. First night in prison, 19 years old. Let me set the scene. Took all day to drive up there, get booked, strip and cavity searched, and get into a cell in receiving. June 2002, SoCal. So it's like 100 degrees inside and out with no ventilation. Shoe prison was surrounded by cows, so the stench was thick in the hot ass air. And there were flies everywhere. They had those bug zapping lights everywhere, so dead flies would just rain down. Waited in a chain link cage, wearing XL orange California CDC prisoner pants and shirt. I was 110 pounds, so I was swimming in that shit. So first night, I finally walk in my cell with my little net bag of hygiene stuff and a nasty ass rough sheet / blanket thing. I meet my bunkie, some call them cellies. Huge woman, like 6'2" and 200 pounds, about 50 years old, with a short butch haircut, acne scars and pit marks, saggy tea-gold bitties with no bra, and no teeth. Forgot her name. Me, 19, 4'10" and 110 pounds. I proceed to make my bed on the top bunk and lay down. She introduces herself. She talked like a child and almost sounded like she was hearing impaired. She clearly had mental disabilities. But she was nice. Could be worse, right? Well, after we introduce ourselves and got cozy in our beds, there's like a 20-minute moment of silence. Suddenly, out of nowhere, with no warning at all, this woman starts punching the underside of the top bunk, with me on the top side. She's repeatedly punching the bed under me and whispering in a completely different and deep voice, "I see you, demon. You can't hide from me. Shut up. Leave me alone." I laid as still as I could, thinking this is not happening to me right now. I just stared out the window, hoping she didn't confuse me with the demon she was seeing. She then got up and began punching the air and arguing with herself and the demon. I don't remember if I slept at all that night and how long that particular behavior lasted. That lady had issues, and I was nothing but nice to her. I learned to ignore her outbursts. She would be normal for a while, and then she would just jolt her head sideways and talk to demons in the deep whisper voice, during the day anyways. The punching of the bed continued every night. I felt sorry for her, really. She wasn't all there and she needed help, but was just thrown in prison instead. She told me she was homeless and stayed in La and was in there for doing drugs. Showed me her needle scars from shooting up drugs. Shit brings tears to my eyes still. Hope she eventually got help. I doubt it though, with the way the system was and is. Drug court, I can't remember, but it was some prop people voted for and mostly everyone in prison was their BC of it. I only bunked with her for a few weeks before they moved her to the yard to do her time. Bless her soul, even though she scared the entire shit out of me. And thank you Jesus for watching over me. I was never really that religious before prison, but let's just say there's a blessed cross hanging above my front door right now. I work in a prison in the UK, most cells have porcelain toilets. When a prisoner wants to get moved to segregation or to a different wing, they will smash their toilet and sink. We ain't obliged to move them in respect to human rights. One day we moved a new prisoner into a cell. The first thing he did was smash the sink and toilet because he did not want to be on the wing. Due to the wing's bad reputation, sadly for him he never looked in the toilet before he smashed it because the previous resident left him a massive floater. He had to wait in his cell for hours with somebody's shit swimming around his feet until we found a cell to move him into. Obviously we took our time. Went to prison, 1 year, white collar stuff. Father died while I was in prison, and they didn't let me go to his funeral. Last time I saw him was through a glass panel in county. I'll never forget it. I was never in jail, but my dad was, and he told me the story of when he met his cellmate and it was a giant black guy, and my dad's first thought was fuck, I'm gonna get raped, but he said the guy was actually pretty cool and would scare people into giving him and my dad extra food. When I asked what he was in for, my dad told me the guy strangled 2 people to death and was just waiting to be moved upstate. Okay, so when I was in juvie years ago, there was 2 guys who didn't get along. So dude spit in the guy's chair. Guy finds out and takes a shirt of dude and jacks off and finishes in his shirt, gives to dude and says, "This was in my stuff." Dude puts it on and gets his face smeared with the juices. We all watched as the guards ran in there to break apart the fight between them. Never saw them after that. What happened to them. I worked kitchen maintenance for about a year, and the company I worked for had the city and county jail and prison contracts. If we were ever around any inmates, we were also under close guard and the inmate presence was at a minimum. The most interesting / scary moment for me was doing maintenance on a massive commercial dish sanitizer when 2 of the inmates were in the same room. Their conversation was so casual that they may as well have been talking about the weather or sports or family dinner. Nope, one was talking about beating and killing someone like it was completely normal. What shocked me the most was not the topic but just how calmly they talked about ending the life of another human. Mine actually happened. It sounds like a comedic sketch halfway through, but believe me, I couldn't have asked for a better experience. I'll start from the beginning. I was 22, my friends and I got pulled over and one of them went to jail for weed. I had a bottle of prescribed promethazine that was a friend of mine's. I tore the label off of. They told me that since I wasn't going to snitch on my friends, I would have a bench warrant out for me for the bottle. They found me 11 months later. I was 23. They found me at a party I was outside of. When they had me searched inside, they had to pair me with a man who didn't speak any English, so he had to watch me undress and spread my beehole so he could copy me. The holding cell was probably 8*X9 with almost 30 people inside. After almost a day and a half of sitting inside the cell, I started to stink and the man called me a whopper, and maybe after about 20 minutes of a small group of men mocking me for my smell, they said I could buzz a guard and ask for a separate room. I thought, good idea. I asked the guy and he told me to stop being a pussy. Lol. Finally I decided to call my mom. I didn't have phone and barely remembered my mom's number. She knew I was in jail but wasn't sure what county and could barely hear me on account of everyone talking in the background, and she says, "Tell them MFN words to STFU." I couldn't move and just said, "Mom, you're going to get me jumped, you STFU." I turned around and announced my mom isn't racist. Thankfully no one got too offended, but I felt awful for even calling my mom. Once I got booked, I went upstairs and had to sleep in our day room for 10 days because all the rooms were full. I met some dudes around my age and we all shared our stories. I ate some type of jail food cook-up which was pretty good. I did my time and got out. It was my first offense and told the judge I wouldn't be back, and I never did. I was in a holding cell for a marijuana possession charge, and at one point they had us all file out of the room and sit on the benches in the processing area so they could clean the room. They told us we weren't allowed to talk while we were out there. Of course most people were whispering to their neighbors, but then the guy sitting next to me starts trying to talk across the room, so one of the guards got onto him about it, and he ignored him, so the guard got pissed and started yelling. Then the guy started muttering, and the guard got on him again. They kept going back and forth, and I realized these motherfuckers are the exact same type of dude. Constitutionally incapable of letting someone else get the last word. I think it ended up with another one of the guards shuffling the first guard off because it just wouldn't stop escalating otherwise. Hi, I've told this story before but I love to share it. My dad went to prison for felony embezzlement and was placed in a program with other peaceful men. These were men who, if they did have a violent past, had proved themselves to be model citizens and thus had other perks and nice things the more violent offenders didn't have. One day a new guy comes into the program and is the most entitled young man my dad ever met. He constantly bitched, constantly one-upped others, talked about how better he was. And eventually another inmate, Carlos, had just had it. Carlos was in prison for murder, but it had been several years and he had thus proven himself to be trustworthy around others. So one day Carlos packs up his items, goes to the cafeteria, and tries to strangle the entitled inmate to death. It was an all-out brawl. Lockdown was initiated, the guards put on riot gear, the whole thing. The entitled inmate survived barely and Carlos was put into solitary. Not me, but a good friend used to work at a pretty high-profile prison in Arizona. He told me a story about how an inmate in solitary was due a meal, and a female guard was bringing it to him. She opens the slot to put the food tray in and inmate proceeds to remove his pants and put his dick through the slot. Well, she keeps her demeanor, leaves and returns with my friend close behind holding a can of bear mace. Inmate proceeds to put his junk in the food slot and my friend gave him the full force of a can of bear mace to the dick hole. When I was in law school, I'd take a group of kids to the county jail every summer for law camp. The lifers were always nice. The psych ward was always full of actual crazies and not Karens claiming to be mentally ill, and the inbounds were normally cracked out of their minds. Had one dude noticed the kids and started jerking off. Had a pair of dudes came smashing against the glass trying to go after the kids in the ward. But most importantly, the bologna sandwiches weren't terrible. Most memorable? We always took the kids into the section where they held the most violent inmates, pulled out the worst inmate at the time. Jail is a month-based sentence / prison is year-based, and allowed the kids to a cell. It was awful. The cell was made of reflective metal all around, but the reflection was distorted. You could only see yourself as a blur of who you were. The cell collected carvings of all the regrets that passed through it. Poems, confessions, you name it. That particular cell was a mindfuck for whom it housed. In a way, it was quite poetic from an outsider's perspective. This was also the jail that housed the inmate who went on a killing spree during his court appearance in Atlanta, if anyone recalls. Let's see, there was a guy next to me bragging about how he would break into women's apartments and steal their underwear. A man was sitting on a freeway, high on acid. He looked exactly like Heath Ledger's Joker without the makeup in my holding tank. I spent some time in jail for a crime I didn't commit. I ended up solving the crime myself. Once I was provided with the discovery, it took me 48 hours. As a result, they waited nearly a year to dismiss my charges, and they refused to prosecute the actual criminal. Never been, but worked in a felony-friendly work environment. You're not getting beat up or raped if you're in for stupid shit. You're a regular Joe. You pay rent, $20 a month, and keep your mouth shut. Stay out of the drama, do your time. That's what I have been told. Prison is really boring. So peeps look for drama. Pay your rent, good to go. No one wants a rape case added to their rap sheet, and Terry's plenty of gay brothers. If you can't pay rent, get your ass a job and pay rent. That's what I was told. I remember being a rep for my dorm and getting called up to the bubble by the lieutenant with the other reps, and he opens the window and leans out of the bubble with an entire cheesecake in one hand and a bottle of Jack Daniels in the other, and he looks at us and goes, "Can anyone identify these two items?" Now for a second I thought we were all gonna get cheesecake and booze, which in jail is pretty high up there on the good day-o-meter. But that wasn't the case. We all stayed quiet, so he eventually answers for us. I capitalized the words he emphasized. This is a cheesecake, and this is a bottle of Jack. I bring a cheesecake and a bottle of Jack to every shift, and if at the end of the day there is still cheesecake on that plate or Jack in that bottle, that means you assholes have created paperwork for me during the day, and I will fuck your shit up. Good day, gentlemen. And with that he closed the window. Didn't even call a deputy to let us back into our cells. We had to go to another bubble and ask them to pop the lock. Worked with an oil change tech years ago who was struggling to get an oil filter off a Dodge with a Cummins engine. Once the filter finally broke free, it dumped oil all over his face and down his back. I rushed over to make sure he was okay. He said, "I'm fine, I'd rather do this every day than get slimed working as a prison guard." He went on to tell me he made a lot of money when he was a prison guard, but it was mostly due to having to work mandatory overtime, which was sometimes a double shift. I've seen a naked man losing his mind in his cell. A supervisor went to go talk to him through the cell door. Buddy then turns around, squats down and sprays a stream of liquid shit directly under the slit of the door from about 4 feet away and covered the supervisor's boots in shit. It was impressive, really. I work in corrections and have a lot of stories. One that stands out to me is an inmate stole his cellmate's full-size VO5 shampoo bottle. As a way to hide it without his cellmate finding it, he shoved the entire thing up his ass. Some other things happened that day and he ends up going to the hole at night and is screaming in pain all night long until he's sent to the hospital in the morning. He had to have emergency surgery, a large section of his intestines removed, and have a gastric bypass bag attached to him forever just because he wanted to steal a shampoo bottle that costs $2.50 on commissary. I worked in the county jail while in college. I mostly worked intake. I had at least 5 fights a night. I was patting down a regular that was wearing ranger panties. He was wasted and had explosive diarrhea when I was checking his waistband. It splattered all over my shoes and hands. I was wearing gloves but it still made me puke. He also wanted to fight, which made it worse. I had to get regular TB and other tests for 6 months. This was one of many times where I feared of transmitting disease to my wife. Luckily I never got anything, but the risk was always there. Fights were common. I'm a big guy, but one night a 90-pound female hit me harder than I've ever been hit before. It turned out she was on PCP and had super strength. It came out of nowhere. A female officer was patting her down when she broke loose and hit me. I took her to the ground and secured her and kept working. In jail you have to shake those things off or you're seen as weak. Thanks for visiting Reddit Town Hall. Have a great day.